I continued at home with my wife and children about 5 months, in a very happy condition, if I could have learned the lesson of knowing when I was well. I left my poor wife, big with child, and accepted an advantageous offer made me to be captain of the Adventure, a stout merchantman of 350 tons. We set sail from Portsmouth upon the 7th day of September, 1710. I had several men died in my ship, so that I was forced to get recruits out of Barbados and the Leeward Islands. The rogues whom I picked up debauched my other men, and they all formed a conspiracy to seize the ship and keep me close prisoner in my cabin, which they did, and sailed many weeks, trading with the Indians. Upon the 9th day of May, 1711, one James Welch came down to my cabin, and said he had orders from the captain to set me ashore. They forced me into the long-boat, letting me put on my best suit of clothes, and allowing me to take with me a small bundle of linen, what money I had, and some other little necessaries. They rowed about a league, and then set me down on a strand. I desired them to tell me what country it was, but they all swore they knew no more than myself, and pushed off immediately, leaving me in a desolate condition. I sat down on a bank to rest myself and consider what I had best to do. When I was a little refreshed, I went up into the country, resolving to deliver myself to the first savages I should meet, and purchase my life from them by some bracelets, glass rings, and other toys. I fell into a beaten road, where I saw many tracks of human feet, and some of cows, but most of horses. At last I beheld several animals in a field, and one or two of the same kind sitting in trees. Their shape was very singular and deformed, which a little discomposed me, so that I lay down behind a thicket to observe them better. Their heads and breasts were covered with a thick hair, some frizzled and others lank. They had beards like goats, and a long ridge of hair down their backs and the foreparts of their legs and feet, but the rest of their bodies were bare, so that I might see their skins, which were of a brown buff colour. They climbed high trees as nimbly as a squirrel, for they had strong extended claws before and behind, terminating in sharp points, and hooked. They would often spring and bound and leap with prodigious agility. Upon the whole, I never beheld in all my travels so disagreeable an animal. Having seen enough, I got up and pursued the beaten road. But I had not gone far when I met one of these creatures full in my way. The ugly monster approached nearer, lifting up his forepaw, so I gave him a good blow with the flat of my sword. He roared so loud that a herd of at least 40 came flocking about me from the next field, howling and making odious faces. Several of this cursed brood, getting hold of the branches behind, leaped up into the tree, from whence they began to discharge their excrements on my head. However, I escaped pretty well by sticking close to the stem of the tree, but was almost stifled with the filth, which fell about me on every side. In the midst of this distress, I observed them all to run away on a sudden as fast as they could, at which I ventured to leave the tree and pursue the road, wondering what it was that could put them into this fright. But looking on my left hand, I saw a horse walking softly in the field, which my persecutors, having sooner discovered, was the cause of their flight. The horse started a little when he came near me, but soon recovering himself, looked full in my face, with manifest tokens of wonder. He viewed my hands and feet, walking round me several times. I would have pursued my journey, but he placed himself directly in the way, yet looking with a very mild aspect, never offering the least violence. We stood gazing at each other for some time. At last I took the boldness to reach my hand towards his neck, with the design to stroke it, using the common style and whistle of jockeys when they are going to handle a strange horse. But this animal, seeming to receive my civilities with disdain, shook his head and bent his brows, softly raising up his left forefoot to remove my hand. Then he neighed 3 or 4 times, but in so different a cadence that I almost began to think he was speaking to himself in some language of his own. While he and I were thus employed, another horse came up, who, applying himself to the first in a very formal manner, they gently struck each other's right hoof before, neighing several times by turns, and varying the sound, which seemed to be almost articulate. The two horses came up close to me, looking with great earnestness upon my face and hands. They went some paces off, as if it were to confer together, walking side by side, backward and forward, like persons deliberating upon some affair of weight, but often turning their eyes towards me, as it were to watch that I might not escape. I was amazed to see such actions and behaviour in brute beasts, and concluded with myself that if the inhabitants of this country were endued with a proportionable degree of reason, they must needs be the wisest people upon earth. This thought gave me so much comfort that I ventured to address them in the following manner. Gentlemen, I make bold to let your worships know that I am a poor distressed Englishman, driven by his misfortunes upon your coast, and I entreat one of you to let me ride upon his back, as if he were a real horse, to some house or village where I can be relieved. In return of which favour, I will make you a present of this knife and bracelet, taking them out of my pocket. The two creatures stood silent while I spoke, seeming to listen with great attention. And when I had ended, they neighed frequently towards each other, as if they were engaged in serious conversation. I could frequently distinguish the word Yahoo, repeated by each of them several times. And although it were impossible for me to conjecture what it meant, yet while the two horses were busy in conversation, I endeavoured to practise this word upon my tongue, and as soon as they were silent, I boldly pronounced Yahoo in a loud voice, imitating, at the same time as near as I could, the neighing of a horse, at which they were both visibly surprised, and the grey repeated the same word twice, as if he meant to teach me the right accent, wherein I spoke after him as well as I could, and found myself perceivably to improve every time, although very far from any degree of perfection. Then the bay tried me with a second word, much harder to be pronounced. Houyhnhnms, Houyhnhnms, Houyhnhnms. I did not succeed in this so well as the former, but after 2 or 3 farther trials I had better fortune, and they both appeared amazed at my capacity. After some farther discourse, which I then conjectured might relate to me, the two friends took their leaves, with the same compliment of striking each other's hoof, and the grey made me signs that I should walk before him, wherein I thought it prudent to comply, till I could find a better director. When I offered to slacken my pace, he would cry, I guessed his meaning, and gave him to understand, as well as I could, that I was weary, and not able to walk faster, upon which he would stand a while to let me rest. Having travelled about 3 miles, we came to a long timber building. The horse made me a sign to go in first. It was a large room, and there were 3 nags and 2 mares, not eating, but some of them sitting down upon their hams, which I very much wondered at, but wondered more to see the rest employed in domestic business. One mare rose from her mat, and coming up close, after having nicely observed my hands and face, gave me a most contemptuous look. Then turning to the horse, I heard the word Yahoo often repeated betwixt them, the meaning of which word I could not then comprehend, although it were the first I had learned to pronounce. But I was soon better informed, to my everlasting mortification. The master horse beckoned to me with his head, and repeating the word Houyhnhnms, Houyhnhnms, as he did upon the road, led me out into a kind of court, some distance from the house. Here we entered, and I saw 3 of those detestable creatures which I first met after my landing, feeding upon roots and the flesh of some animals, which I afterwards found to be that of asses and dogs, and now and then a cow, dead by accident or disease. They were all tied by the neck, and fastened to a beam. They held their food between the claws of their forefeet, and tore it with their teeth. The master horse ordered a sorrel nag, one of his servants, to untie the largest of these animals, and take him into the yard. The beast and I were brought close together, and our countenances diligently compared, both by master and servant, who thereupon repeated several times the word Yahoo. My horror and astonishment are not to be described, when I observed in this abominable animal a perfect human figure. The face of it indeed was flat and broad, the nose depressed, the lips large, and the mouth wide. But these differences are common to all savage nations, where the lineaments of the countenance are distorted by the natives suffering their infants to lie grovelling on the earth, or by carrying them on their backs, nuzzling with their face against the mother's shoulders. The 4 feet of the Yahoo differed from my hands in nothing else but the length of the nails, the coarseness and brownness of the palms, and the hairiness on the backs. There was the same resemblance between our feet, with the same differences, which I knew very well, though the horses did not, because of my shoes and stockings. The same in every part of our bodies, except as to hairiness and colour, which I have already described. The great difficulty that seemed to stick with the 2 horses was to see the rest of my body so very different from that of a Yahoo, for which I was obliged to my clothes, whereof they had no conception. About noon I saw coming towards the house a kind of vehicle drawn like a sledge by 4 Yahoos. There was in it an old steed, who seemed to be of quality. He alighted with his hind feet forward, having by accident got a hurt in his left forefoot. He came to dine with our horse, who received him with great civility. They dined in the best room, and had oats boiled in milk for the second course, which the old horse ate warm, but the rest cold. I was given oats and milk too, which was at first a very insipid diet, but grew tolerable by time. This was not the first experiment I had made how easily nature is satisfied, and I cannot but observe that I never had 1 hour's sickness while I stayed in this island. 'Tis true, I sometimes made a shift to catch a rabbit or bird by springes made of Yahoo's hairs, and I often gathered wholesome herbs, which I boiled, or ate as salads with my bread, and now and then, for a rarity, I made a little butter, and drank the whey. I was at first at a great loss for salt, but custom soon reconciled the want of it, and I am confident that the frequent use of salt among us is an effect of luxury, and was first introduced only as a provocative to drink, except where it is necessary for preserving of flesh in long voyages, or in places remote from great markets. For we observe no animal to be fond of it but man, and as to myself, when I left this country, it was a great while before I could endure the taste of it in anything that I ate. This is enough to say upon the subject of my diet, wherewith other travellers fill their books, as if the readers were personally concerned whether we fared well or ill. However, it was necessary to mention this matter, lest the world should think it impossible that I could find sustenance for 3 years in such a country, and among such inhabitants. When it grew towards evening, the master horse ordered a place for me to lodge in. It was but 6 yards from the house, and separated from the stable of the Yahoos. Here I got some straw, and covering myself with my own clothes, slept very sound. My principal endeavour was to learn the language, which my master, for so I shall henceforth call him, and his children, and every servant of his house, were desirous to teach me, for they looked upon it as a prodigy that a brute animal should discover such marks of a rational creature. I pointed to everything and inquired the name of it, which I wrote down in my journal book when I was alone, and corrected my bad accent by desiring those of the family to pronounce it often. In this employment a sorrel nag, one of the under-servants, was very ready to assist me. In about 10 weeks' time I was able to understand most of his questions, and in 3 months could give him some tolerable answers. He was extremely curious to know from what part of the country I came, and how I was taught to imitate a rational creature, because the Yahoos, whom he saw I exactly resembled in my head, hands, and face, with some appearance of cunning and the strongest disposition to mischief, were observed to be the most unteachable of all brutes. I answered that I came over the sea, from a far place, with many others of my own kind, in a great hollow vessel made of the bodies of trees. It was with some difficulty, and by the help of many signs, that I brought him to understand me. He replied that I must needs be mistaken, or that I said the thing which was not, for they have no word in their language to express lying or falsehood. He knew it was impossible that there could be a country beyond the sea, or that a parcel of brutes could move a wooden vessel whither they pleased upon water. He was sure no Houyhnhnm alive could make such a vessel, or would trust Yahoos to manage it. The word Houyhnhnm in their tongue signifies a horse, and in its etymology the perfection of nature. I told my master that I was at a loss for expression, but would improve as fast as I could, and hoped in a short time I should be able to tell him wonders. He directed his own mare, his colt and foal, and the servants of the family to take all opportunities of instructing me, and he was at the same pains himself, so that in 5 months from my arrival I understood whatever was spoke, and could express myself tolerably well. The Houyhnhnms who came to visit my master could hardly believe me to be a right Yahoo, because my body had a different covering from others of my kind. I had hitherto concealed the secret of my dress in order to distinguish myself as much as possible from that cursed race of Yahoos. But I explained to my master that in the country from whence I came, those of my kind always covered their bodies with clothes. After which my master said, it was plain I must be a perfect Yahoo, but that I differed very much from the rest of my species in the softness and whiteness and smoothness of my skin, and in that I could speak like a Houyhnhnm, and seemed in my words and actions to discover some glimmerings of reason. Under his promise of not being offended, I said that I was as much astonished to see the Houyhnhnms act like rational beings as he or his friends could be in finding some marks of reason in a creature he was pleased to call a Yahoo. I said farther that our countrymen would hardly think it probable that a Houyhnhnm should be the presiding creature of a nation and a Yahoo the brute. My master heard me with great appearances of uneasiness in his countenance, especially when I explained how the Houyhnhnms, whom we called horses in my country, were used there. After some expressions of great indignation, he wondered how we dared to venture upon a Houyhnhnm's back. However, he said no more, because he was desirous to hear my own story, and of the country where I was born. I assured my master how extremely desirous I was that he should be satisfied in every point, but I doubted much whether it would be possible for me to explain myself on several subjects whereof his honour could have no conception, because I saw nothing in his country to which I could resemble them. I said my birth was of honest parents in an island called England, which was remote from this country as many days' journey as the strongest of his honour's servants could travel in the annual course of the sun. That I was bred a surgeon, whose trade it is to cure wounds and hurts in the body, got by accident or violence, that my country was governed by a female man, whom we called a queen, that I left it to get riches, whereby I might maintain myself and family when I should return, that in my last voyage I was commander of the ship, and had about 50 Yahoos under me, many of which died at sea, and I was forced to supply them by others picked out from several nations, that our ship was twice in danger of being sunk, the first time by a great storm, and the second by striking against a rock. Here my master interposed by asking me how I could persuade strangers out of different countries to venture with me, after the losses I had sustained and the hazards I had run. I said they were fellows of desperate fortunes, forced to fly from the places of their birth on account of their poverty or their crimes. Some were undone by lawsuits. Others spent all they had in drinking, whoring, and gaming. Others fled for treason. Many for murder, theft, poisoning, robbery, perjury, forgery, coining false money, for committing rapes or sodomy, for flying from their colours or deserting to the enemy, and most of them had broken prison. None of these durst return to their native countries for fear of being hanged. He was wholly at a loss to know what could be the use or necessity of practising those vices, to clear up which I endeavoured to give him some ideas of the desire of power and riches, of the terrible effects of lust, intemperance, malice, and envy. All this I was forced to define and describe by putting of cases and making suppositions. After which, like one whose imagination was struck with something never seen or heard of before, he would lift up his eyes with amazement and indignation. Power, government, war, law, punishment, and 1,000 other things had no terms wherein their language could express them, which made the difficulty almost insuperable to give my master any conception of what I meant. In many conversations I had with my master for above 2 years, I laid before him, as well as I could, the whole state of Europe, trade, arts, and sciences. He asked me what were the usual causes or motives that made one country go to war with another. I answered they were innumerable, but I should only mention a few of the chief. Sometimes the ambition of princes, who never think they have land or people enough to govern. Sometimes the corruption of ministers, who engage their master in a war in order to stifle or divert the clamour of the subjects against their evil administration. Difference in opinions hath cost many millions of lives, for instance, whether flesh be bread, or bread be flesh, whether the juice of a certain berry be blood or wine, whether whistling be a vice or a virtue. Sometimes our neighbours want the things which we have, or have the things which we want, and we both fight till they take ours or give us theirs. We spoke of many things, and my master could find little resemblance between Yahoos of his country and those in ours. His honour often allowed me to go among the herds of Yahoos in the neighbourhood, with one of his servants, a strong sorrel nag, to be my guard. The Yahoos would imitate my actions after the manner of monkeys, but ever with great signs of hatred, as a tame jackdaw with cap and stockings is always persecuted by the wild ones when he happens to be got among them. They swim from their infancy like frogs, and are able to continue long under water, where they often take fish, which the females carry home to their young. And upon this occasion I hope the reader will pardon my relating an odd adventure. Being one day abroad with my protector, the sorrel nag, and the weather exceeding hot, I entreated him to let me bathe in a river that was near. He consented, and I immediately stripped myself stark naked and went down softly into the stream. It happened that a young female Yahoo, standing behind a bank, saw the whole proceeding, and inflamed by desire, as the nag and I conjectured, came running with all speed, and leaped into the water within 5 yards of the place where I bathed. I was never in my life so terribly frighted. The nag was grazing at some distance, not suspecting any harm. She embraced me after a most fulsome manner. I roared as loud as I could, and the nag came galloping towards me, whereupon she quitted her grasp with the utmost reluctancy, and leaped upon the opposite bank, where she stood gazing and howling all the time I was putting on my clothes. This was matter of diversion to my master and his family, as well as mortification to myself. For now I could no longer deny that I was a real Yahoo in every limb and feature, since the females had a natural propensity to me as one of their own species. I think she could not be above 11 years old. The noble Houyhnhnms are endowed by nature with a general disposition to all virtues, and have no idea of evil in a rational creature, so their grand maxim is to cultivate reason. Friendship and benevolence are the two principal virtues among the Houyhnhnms, and these not confined to particular objects, but universal to the whole race. For a stranger from the remotest part is equally treated with the nearest neighbour, and wherever he goes looks upon himself as at home. They preserve decency and civility in the highest degrees, but are altogether ignorant of ceremony. They have no fondness for their colts or foals, but the care they take in educating them proceedeth entirely from the dictates of reason. And I observed my master to show the same affection to his neighbour's issue that he had for his own. In their marriages they are exactly careful to choose such colours as will not make any disagreeable mixture in the breed. Strength is chiefly valued in the male, and comeliness in the female, not upon the account of love, but to preserve the race from degenerating. For where a female happens to excel in strength, a consort is chosen with regard to comeliness. Courtship, love, presents, jointures, settlements have no place in their thoughts, or terms whereby to express them in their language. The young couple meet and are joined, merely because it is the determination of their parents and friends. It is what they see done every day, and they look upon it as one of the necessary actions in a reasonable being. But the violation of marriage, or any other unchastity, was never heard of, and the married pair pass their lives with the same friendship and mutual benevolence that they bear to others of the same species who come in their way, without jealousy, fondness, quarrelling, or discontent. Temperance, industry, exercise, and cleanliness are the lessons equally enjoined to the young ones of both sexes, and my master thought it monstrous in us to give the females a different kind of education from the males, except in some articles of domestic management, whereby, as he truly observed, 1/2 of our natives were good for nothing but bringing children into the world, and to trust the care of their children to such useless animals, he said, was yet a greater instance of brutality. But the Houyhnhnms train up their youth to strength, speed, and hardiness by exercising them in running races up and down steep hills or over hard, stony grounds, and when they are all in a sweat, they are ordered to leap over head and ears into a pond or a river. 4 times a year the youth of certain districts meet to show their proficiency in running and leaping and other feats of strength or agility, where the victor is rewarded with a song made in his or her praise. On this festival the servants drive a herd of yahoos into the field, laden with hay and oats and milk, for a repast to the Houyhnhnms, after which these brutes are immediately driven back again, for fear of being noisome to the assembly. One of the grand assemblies of the Houyhnhnms was held in my time, about 3 months before my departure. The question to be debated was whether the yahoos should be exterminated from the surface of the earth. Several arguments of great strength and weight were offered, alleging that the yahoos were the most filthy, noisome, and deformed animal which nature ever produced, that they would privately suck the teats of the Houyhnhnms' cows, kill and devour their cats, trample down their oats and grass, and commit 1,000 other extravagancies. My master spoke, and said that he had in his possession a certain wonderful yahoo, meaning myself, that I spoke in a language of my own, and had thoroughly learnt theirs, that when he saw me without my covering, I was an exact yahoo in every part, only of a whiter colour, less hairy, and with shorter claws. He added how I had endeavoured to persuade him that in my own and other countries the yahoos acted as the governing, rational animal, and held the Houyhnhnms in servitude. That, among other things, I mentioned a custom we had of castrating Houyhnhnms when they were young, in order to render them tame. My master said that this invention might be practised upon the younger yahoos here, which, besides rendering them tractable and fitter for use, would, in an age, put an end to the whole species without destroying life. In the meantime, the Houyhnhnms should be exhorted to cultivate the breed of asses, which are in all respects more valuable brutes. The Houyhnhnms have no letters and consequently their knowledge is all traditional. They calculate the year by the revolution of the sun and the moon, but use no subdivisions into weeks. In poetry they must be allowed to excel all other mortals, wherein the justness of their similes and the minuteness as well as exactness of their descriptions are indeed inimitable. Their verses abound very much in both of these, and usually contain either some exalted notions of friendship and benevolence, or the praises of those who were victors in races. They live generally to 70 or 75 years, very seldom to 80. Some weeks before their death they feel a gradual decay, but without pain. During this time they are much visited by their friends, because they cannot go abroad with their usual ease and satisfaction. However, about 10 days before their death, which they seldom fail in computing, they return the visits that have been made them by those who are nearest in the neighbourhood, being carried in a convenient sledge drawn by Yahoos, which vehicle they use not only upon this occasion, but when they grow old upon long journeys, or when they are lamed by an accident. And therefore, when the dying Houyhnhnms return those visits, they take a solemn leave of their friends, as if they were going to some remote part of the country, where they designed to pass the rest of their lives. I know not whether it may be worth observing that the Houyhnhnms have no word in their language to express anything that is evil, except what they borrow from the deformities or ill qualities of the Yahoos. Thus they denote the folly of a servant, an omission of a child, a stone that cuts their feet, a continuance of foul or unseasonable weather, and the like, by adding to each the epithet of Yahoo. But now I proceed to relate my own sad catastrophe. I had settled my little economy to my heart's content. My master had ordered a room to be made for me. I enjoyed excellent food, made clothes from skins, and enjoyed perfect health of body and tranquillity of mind. I had the favour of being admitted to several Houyhnhnms, who came to visit or dine with my master, and I would listen to their discourse, where no person spoke without pleasing his companions, where there was no interruption, tediousness, heat, or difference of sentiments. They have a notion that when people are met together, a short silence doth much improve conversation. This I found to be true. When I thought of my family, my friends, my countrymen, or human race in general, I considered them as they really were. Yahoos, in shape and disposition, perhaps a little more civilized, and qualified with the gift of speech, but making no other use of reason than to improve and multiply their vices. I looked upon the Houyhnhnms with delight, and thought myself to be fully settled for life with them, when I was commanded by the assembly to go back to the place from whence I came. I was struck with the utmost grief and despair, and pushed off from shore in a canoe, which I had been allowed to build, on February the 15th, 1715. I made for the southwest point of New Holland, where some Portuguese seamen took me to their captain, Pedro de Mendez. I was ready to faint at the smell of him and his men, and was going to leap in the sea and swim for my life, rather than continue among Yahoos. But one of the seamen prevented me, and I was chained to my cabin. The captain, a wise man, insisted I must give him my word of honour to bear him company in this voyage without attempting anything against my life, or else he would continue me a prisoner till we arrived at Lisbon. I gave him the promise he required, but at the same time protested that I would suffer the greatest hardships rather than return to live among Yahoos. Our voyage passed without any considerable accident. In gratitude to the captain, I sometimes sat with him at his earnest request, and strove to conceal my antipathy against humankind, although it often broke out, which he suffered to pass without observation. But the greatest part of the day I confined myself to my cabin, to avoid seeing any of the crew. We arrived at Lisbon, November the 5th, 1715. At our landing, the captain forced me to cover myself with his cloak, to prevent the rabble from crowding about me. I was conveyed to his own house, and, at my earnest request, he led me up to the highest room backwards. I conjured him to conceal from all persons what I had told him of the Houyhnhnms, because the least hint of such a story would not only draw numbers of people to see me, but probably put me in danger of being imprisoned or burnt by the Inquisition. The captain persuaded me to accept a suit of clothes, newly made, but I would not suffer the tailor to take my measure. However, Don Pedro being almost of my size, they fitted me well enough. He accoutred me with other necessaries, all new, which I aired for 24 hours before I would use them. The captain had no wife, nor above 3 servants, none of which were suffered to attend at meals, and his whole deportment was so obliging, added to very good human understanding, that I really began to tolerate his company. He gained so far upon me that I ventured to look out of the back window. By degrees I was brought into another room, from whence I peeped into the street, but drew my head back in a fright. In a week's time he seduced me down to the door. I found my terror gradually lessened, but my hatred and contempt seemed to increase. I was at last bold enough to walk the street in his company, but kept my nose well stopped with rue, or sometimes with tobacco. In 10 days Don Pedro, to whom I had given some account of my domestic affairs, put it upon me as a point of honour and conscience that I ought to return to my native country and live at home with my wife and children. He told me there was an English ship in the port just ready to sail, and he would furnish me with all things necessary. It would be tedious to repeat his arguments and my contradictions. He said it was altogether impossible to find such a solitary island as I had desired to live in, but I might command in my own house, and pass my time in a manner as recluse as I pleased. I left Lisbon the 24th day of November in an English merchantman, but who was the master I never inquired. Don Pedro accompanied me to the ship, and lent me £20. He took kind leave of me, and embraced me at parting, which I bore as well as I could. During this last voyage I had no commerce with the master or any of his men, but pretending I was sick, kept close in my cabin. On the 5th of December 1715, we cast anchor in the Downs about 9 in the morning, and at 3 in the afternoon I got safe to my house at Redriff. My wife and family received me with great surprise and joy, because they concluded me certainly dead. But I must freely confess the sight of them filled me only with hatred, disgust, and contempt, and the more by reflecting on the near alliance I had to them. For although, since my unfortunate exile from the Houyhnhnm country, I had compelled myself to tolerate the sight of Yahoos, and to converse with Don Pedro de Mendez, yet my memory and imaginations were perpetually filled with the virtues and ideas of those exalted Houyhnhnms. And when I began to consider that by copulating with one of the Yahoo species I had become a parent of more, it struck me with the utmost shame, confusion, and horror. As soon as I entered the house, my wife took me in her arms and kissed me, at which, having not been used to the touch of that odious animal for so many years, I fell in a swoon for almost an hour. At the time I am writing, it is 5 years since my last return to England. During the first year, I could not endure my wife or children in my presence. The very smell of them was intolerable. Much less could I suffer them to eat in the same room. To this hour they dare not presume to touch my bread, or drink out of the same cup. Neither was I ever able to let one of them take me by the hand. The first money I laid out was to buy 2 young stone horses, which I keep in a good stable, and next to them the groom is my greatest favourite. For I feel my spirits revived by the smell he contracts in the stable. My horses understand me tolerably well. I converse with them at least 4 hours every day. They are strangers to bridle or saddle. They live in great amity with me, and friendship to each other. Thus, gentle reader, I have given thee a faithful history of my travels for 16 years and above 7 months, wherein I have not been so studious of ornament as of truth. I could perhaps, like others, have astonished thee with strange, improbable tales. But I rather chose to relate plain matter of fact, in the simplest manner and style, because my principal design was to inform, and not to amuse thee. The British nation may be an example to the whole world for their wisdom, care, and justice in planting colonies. Their choice of devout and able pastors to propagate Christianity, and their strict regard to the distribution of justice. But I doubt whether our conquests in the countries I treat of would be as easy as those of Ferdinando Cortez over the naked Americans. The Lilliputians, I think, are hardly worth the charge of a fleet and army to reduce them, and I question whether it might be prudent or safe to attempt the Brobdingnagians, or whether an English army would be much at their ease with the flying island over their heads. The Houyhnhnms, indeed, appear not to be so well prepared for war, a science to which they are perfect strangers, and especially against missive weapons. However, supposing myself to be a minister of state, I could never give my advice for invading them. Their prudence, unanimity, unacquaintedness with fear, and their love of their country would amply supply all defects in the military art. Imagine 20,000 of them breaking into the midst of an European army, confounding the ranks, overturning the carriages, battering the warriors' faces by terrible yerks from their hinder hoofs. But instead of proposals for conquering that magnanimous nation, I rather wish they were in a capacity or disposition to send a sufficient number of their inhabitants for civilizing Europe, by teaching us the first principles of honour, justice, truth, temperance, public spirit, fortitude, chastity, friendship, benevolence, and fidelity. But as those countries which I have described do not appear to have any desire of being conquered and enslaved, murdered, or driven out by colonies, nor abound either in gold, silver, sugar, or tobacco, I did humbly conceive they were by no means proper objects of our zeal, our valour, or our interest. However, if those whom it more concerns think fit to be of another opinion, I am ready to depose, when I shall be lawfully called, that no European did ever visit those countries before me. I mean, if the inhabitants ought to be believed. But as to the formality of taking possession in my sovereign's name, it never came once into my thoughts, and if it had, yet as my affairs then stood, I should perhaps in point of prudence and self-preservation have put it off to a better opportunity. Having thus answered the only objection that can ever be raised against me as a traveller, I here take a final leave of my courteous readers, and return to enjoy my own speculations in my little garden at Redriff, to apply those excellent lessons of virtue which I learned among the Houyhnhnms, to instruct the Yahoos of my own family, as far as I shall find them docible animals, to behold my figure often in a glass, and thus, if possible, habituate myself by time to tolerate the sight of a human creature, to lament the brutality of Houyhnhnms in my own country, but always treat their persons with respect for the sake of my noble master, his family, his friends, and the whole Houyhnhnm race, whom these of ours have the honour to resemble in all their lineaments, however their intellectuals came to degenerate. I began last week to permit my wife to sit at dinner with me, at the farthest end of a long table, and to answer, but with the utmost brevity, the few questions I ask her. Yet, the smell of a Yahoo continuing very offensive, I always keep my nose well stopped with rue, lavender, or tobacco leaves, and although it be hard for a man late in life to remove old habits, I am not altogether out of hopes, in some time, to suffer a neighbour Yahoo in my company, without the apprehensions I am yet under of his teeth or his claws. My reconcilement to the Yahoo kind in general might not be so difficult if they would be content with those vices and follies only which nature hath entitled them to. I am not in the least provoked at the sight of a lawyer, a pickpocket, a colonel, a fool, a lord, a gamester, a politician, a whoremonger, a physician, an evidence, a suborner, an attorney, a traitor, or the like. This is all according to the due course of things. But when I behold a lump of deformity and diseases, both in body and mind, smitten with pride, it immediately breaks all the measures of my patience. Neither shall I be ever able to comprehend how such an animal and such a vice could tally together. The wise and virtuous Houyhnhnms, who abound in all excellencies that can adorn a rational creature, have no name for this vice in their language, which hath no terms to express anything that is evil, except those whereby they describe the detestable qualities of their Yahoos, among which they were not able to distinguish this of pride, for want of thoroughly understanding human nature, as it showeth itself in other countries, where that animal presides. But I, who had more experience, could plainly observe some rudiments of it among the wild Yahoos. But the Houyhnhnms, who live under the government of reason, are no more proud of the good qualities they possess than I should be for not wanting a leg or an arm, which no man in his wits would boast of, although he must be miserable without them. I dwell the longer upon this subject from the desire I have to make the society of an English Yahoo by any means not insupportable, and therefore I here entreat those who have any tincture of this absurd vice that they will not presume to appear in my sight.